Next up is going to be Govert, followed by James. Do you guys want to comment on this discussion, or do you want to go to the question on what do you disagree with Nietzsche on? Govert, you can do either of them at this point. Govert.
Yeah, or I can blend them.
Go ahead. Perfect.
So one of the things that I'm not in accord with Nietzsche is his too dark of a vision of nature. He really wants to go back to kind of a natural state, all kinds of non-verbal ways of being. But his vision of nature is too much that it's a continuous struggle. It's always mutual exploitation. Therefore, you got a justification of a stratified society where the upper class has a justification to exploit the working class. And that bleeds, of course, into, how the Nazis took care of him. So the element that misses is, for example, and he was also a naturalist and thinker and anarchist, that's Kropotkin. Pyotr Kropotkin, who had a very subtle philosophy of cooperation as seen in nature itself. So I think if you had read some Kropotkin, I think some of his starker social ideas would have become a little softer.
Oh, wonderful. So folks, let's do one thing. Let everybody just express what their disagreements are. Okay, let's not respond to each other, because I want to get all the disagreements, all the observations that people have on the table. Next up is going to be Phil. Phil, what do you disagree with Nietzsche on?
Well, I'm not sure if I disagree. It's just a matter of extremes. If nature, in a sense, don't have a value, human beings have values. We see value in things. That may ultimately be good for human beings. But how is that justice for other beings, which, since we hold such enormous power over other beings, how are they going to live in any just way? Without human beings, it seems to me nature have found a balance between other things that struggle, and there seems to be a balance, but human being has such power now to push its values into nature that, in a sense, there is only a kind of predominant over domination and exploitation of nature. Could you address how you're going to deal with that?
No question, just opinions about what you disagree on. So that's what you disagree. So I want to get those things out, because that's an important theme. We've done several meetups on Nietzsche. We have explored different angles, and I want to hear, just what you guys are thinking. Brian, followed by Kevin. Brian, what do you disagree with?
As I've experienced Nietzsche, because I don't claim to have absorbed all of him or it, I also disagree with the emphasis on conflict as opposed to cooperation.
Excellent. Thank you. Next up is Kevin.
Yes, thank you, Shankar. I disagree with one part. Science is worse. All truths are kept silent, become poisons. So for another thing, we think speech is silver, silence is golden. So I would say this consider East side value there from Islam, East Asia, obviously Indian, slightly like this. Quiet, we value the quiet. But here, so like it seemed to me, the truth need a big voice to claim it. It's the truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. James, did you have something?
Yeah, I wanted to maybe kind of disagree with Nietzsche's the overemphasis on the individual that he has put himself in a position where he cannot relate to society in a kind of positive manner and sees himself isolated, from the rest of society. And yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, James. Anybody else wants to talk about? Dan, what about you? What do you disagree with Nietzsche on?
I disagree with Nietzsche that democracy is poisonous. I think it can be poisonous, but I think the idea of what we're practicing democracy here, there's a certain degree of mutuation. I think that the reason why he disagrees with it is the same reason why he disagrees with morality, that morality and democracy caters to the lowest common denominator. It caters to the most base part about human nature. And if people are ruled by those base parts, it doesn't give society enough time to flourish. And that's where Nietzsche's right. But I think Nietzsche's wrong in that he thinks that democracy will only prove out to be disastrous, in the same way that Plato thought democracy was bad, because democracy is a ship of fools without a commander, without a captain. Inevitably, it will turn to needing a tyrant. So,
thank you. For me, I think that he's a lion, and he doesn't value what culture has done. And he, another way of putting it, I agree with Phil, he doesn't realize that there is Vishnu, that there is sustaining process that is needed to keep life going, not only in nature, but in culture. You can't, that is a crucial part of human experience, where I think he gets something really fundamental is that he understands the power of will within an individual, what an individual can do. He has an exalted view of the individual. And I agree with that. But that is there in every individual. That potential exists in every individual. He doesn't get that. He thinks only few people. So that, again, I disagree with him, like that potential is there in everybody. And as a result, you really need to build a society, building, you're talking about democracy. I call it republic of basically, you need kind of an arrangement of people. You need to work with people in order to create a city, build a city, build a country so that we can all flourish. And that is good. And it has to be done in a way which protects the individual. So that founding fathers kind of got it right. It says the core is there within an individual, and you build the culture in order to protect and enable the individual to pursue their own initiative. So I don't think that Nietzsche gets that part of the cooperation that is actually what you're standing on. He's standing on that. You can't have anything without that. So I think he's a lion, and he is against the camel in his. Even the metaphor of camel has the negative connotations of it. So that's what I would. Lloyd, what do you disagree with Nietzsche on?
Like you're saying, I think that the emphasis too heavily on the individual. I think one thing people don't realize in a democracy is that individual liberty is not an absolute. Just like free speech is not an absolute. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie house. You can't say anything about people that you want in the media because now there's lawsuits and defamation protections. So these are not absolutes. So if your reason for not taking the vaccine is because of my individual liberty, you're not understanding that in a pandemic, sometimes the needs of society do outweigh your own individual needs. Most of the time, like you say, you can do what you want. But in certain cases, you have to understand that individual liberty is not absolute, and the needs of society can outweigh individual liberty.
Thank you. David, what do you think? What do you disagree with Nietzsche on?
Me?
Yep.
Okay, all right. Well, I think you were pinpointing the reason for what I've said before, his whole throwing out the idea of morality, and I think he would put it in terms of God, but that's, the way he's saying it. This sort of that there's any sort of absolute for us to grasp to, because that, sort of rests on the idea that we can have common visions. And so he's writing these, and these are for individual people to read. This is directed towards a person. This is a personal statement about get your freedom. And so he's dealing at that level, but only being at that level, even though he's analyzing society, he's talking to an individual in these writings, I feel. But he's not saying this could be structured so we can work together. As you're saying, we do have to coordinate with you. Power is multiplied exponentially as we come together. And this is where real social power and culture, you're saying he's ignoring, I agree, come from. And that's the realm where morality starts to kick in, because there's no love with that. I mean, where's the love in this? The value for all the other people that actually, if you love, you're going to be doing something he's not talking about.
Wonderful. Beautifully put. Thank you. Thank you, David. Phil, what about you? What do you disagree with Nietzsche on?
Well, you keep calling him a lion. I wonder whether that's a noun, like a lion, a tiger, or whether that's a verb. He's L-Y-I-N-G.
No, a gerund. A gerund would be more appropriate.
Yeah. No, that's
I rather like L-Y-I-N-G.
no,
Okay.
no, that's not. He's not doing that. I mean, that's another thing I like about him. No, he's not doing that. I mean, the thing is that he is. I mean, the thing I respect. See, with all the criticism, I have very strong criticisms, but there is a tremendous respect I have for him, because he's actually speaking out on things that are happening at his time. And he's actually pointing out to some general patterns that these ideas that people have been using are no longer actually explaining things. You need to reevaluate things. Don't just mindlessly go about your life without thinking about it. Challenge everything. Listen to your conscience. That is profound truth. It's not lying. And in the process of discovering, and again, I always give, I give a very, I give a pass to creators, okay? Because what happens is that when you create something, create a new idea, many times you forget, in order to actually crystallize it, because it's not there. It's like your baby, he has created this idea of the power that is there in individual. He has formulated it in a brilliant way. While doing that, many times when the creators are doing it for the first time, they kind of miss a lot of things which are not that. And in order to push that away, in order to make those distinctions, they do that. So for that, I have, I give them a lot of leeway. But at the same time, when we are trying to understand and trying to learn from them, we have to use our entire context of what we know. We can't forget what we have created here in America, where you have a system in order to protect the individual. And that has made possible a level of prosperity and happiness on a scale that is completely beyond what can be done by an individual simply saying no to its culture. So can't ignore those achievements. So that's what I mean. So that's why I don't want to disparage him by using words like lying. But next up is Mike.
His hallmark thing in my book is eternal recurrence. And I think that concept is stupid and oversimplified. And that also begets the statement he rejects social Darwinism, and and he's too polarized in how he rejects social Darwinism. So neither democracy nor liberalism nor Hobbesian dictatorships or the benevolent philosopher king, neither of those work in his he does sort of work on survival of the fittest in a harsh world. My criticism. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Anybody else wants to add to the criticism? Okay. All right. So what we're going to do, Govard, go ahead.
I think there's a way still to use Nietzsche against Nietzsche, to use some of his concepts to overcome some of the criticisms here. The one thing that I'm referring to is that he did have a very deep and abiding understanding of Darwinism, but not complete. So, you know, what Kropotkin was finding in nature, cooperation, if he, you know, included that, he would go indeed with a more cooperative view. At the same time, liberalism and democracy can be justified with his concept of the will to power. Because, you know, if the will to power in a collective way expresses itself as wanting democracy, there's nothing that wrong with it. If it expresses itself, you know, now in Afghanistan, that, you know, you go back to the Stone Age, he would say, so be it. So there are ways to overcome the you know, and I would say they're minor criticisms. They have big influence, but they're minor and they can be overcome within his own philosophy.
Thank you, Govard. So the next question, the flip question of that, go ahead.
I have one last.
Please.
And this has not been said all night for the last, it was said last week, but Nietzsche on women. I think Nietzsche had it wrong, but after spending a week trying to collect up as much aphorisms that Nietzsche had on women, I realized something. I think that Nietzsche wasn't so much against women, he was just against what custom did. It turned women into clowns, childish clowns, as he saw it. And he wanted women to be liberated from that, because in some ways he thought that a woman who was wild and free was a far more better steward in bringing out the best in their counterpart, the male. But more importantly, that she herself would have room to pursue her own energies, rather than just being, as Nietzsche says, a slave and a tyrant to male. And I think that the problem with Nietzsche is that he was raised by women. He lost his father at a young age. He lost the monarchy at a young age. He was meant to be the monarch's minister. He was meant to be the basic priest of Prussia. So Nietzsche was no slouch in the way that he was intellectual and he was intelligent, and he came from a family of intelligent people. But the times were different, and democracy broke out after the Franco-Prussian War, and Nietzsche had to leave Germany and let go of his German citizenship. He became a Swiss citizen that year. But his attitude towards women and democracy was abhorrent, because both in his life had disappointed him in many different ways. Not only the several attempts that he made to the proposal of marriage and the menage a trois that he got rejected from on top of it, but Nietzsche became a very lonely person, and that affected how he thought of women and how he thought of mankind. And it made him a little bit more gross and toxic because of it. But on top of that view that he was against democracy for personal reasons, again, he was meant to be part of the aristocracy of the monarch of Prussia. That was meant to be his life. But at a young age, all of that got usurped, and therefore his family had no purpose in Prussia other than to send him to get a good education, and he became a philosopher instead of a minister, a Lutheran minister. So Nietzsche was very resentful of democracy because of that. Now, I think the main reason what Nietzsche's critique is of morality comes to this point where he sees it in Human, All Too Human. I forget what essay it's on the religious life, but one of his viewpoints is that if you take a group of people who have to come together cooperatively and build a house, they will do well. They will build a house that was reliable, that's based on the right amount of facts, based on the right amount of measurement, based on the right amount of reason, so forth, so forth. But when you ask the same group of people to come together and figure out what is good, what is second good, what is third good, what is worst, and what things should be prohibited, what values should we have, how should we govern our interactions, this is a completely different task than the first one. And if we try to take the thinking that we learned in the first task and try to apply it to the second task, what Nietzsche thinks is that you'll wind up with Judeo-Christianity. And the problem with that is that the system itself, it caters to the base aspect of human nature. That is murder and exploitation are the two prohibitives. But it doesn't tell the human subject to how to be compassionate and how to be human and authentic this way. These aren't its values. And because of that, the human being is left in despair because they've only just been told, these are the two things that you should obsess about not doing. It hasn't told you what to do. And if you're left with that, you're left with a value system that is completely alien to your everyday life.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Dan. All right, now let's take the flip question, which is actually more important than the question of what you disagree with, because it is easy to kind of disagree with something and say, okay, you know, I just disagree with it, so it doesn't have any impact. So the question is, what do you profoundly agree with Nietzsche on? Or more importantly, what have you learned from Nietzsche? What's the most important thing that you take away from Nietzsche? If you'd like to answer that, go ahead and I encourage you to do that. Go ahead and type exclamation mark. Lloyd, are you familiar with Nietzsche? Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I just saw the quote that you had.
No, let's do one thing. Lloyd, just let everybody who has been watching, who has been participating in like 5 different meetups, talk first, then I'll come to you. Okay.
Sure.
Thanks. Phil, what do you get from Nietzsche? What do you learn from Nietzsche?
What I learned from Nietzsche is that the only thing you have in control of your life is action that you do through your own will. And that is the thing that sets your personal destiny. That's a very, very important, because you are in control finally of your destiny.
Wonderful, wonderful, absolutely beautiful. Next up is Dave.
What I've learned about Dr. Nietzsche is that he was a very troubled man, had very difficult physical problems, but he overcame it unbelievably and did great work. And so, well worth studying. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Brian, followed by Dan. Brian.
Well, I've been reading Nietzsche off and on my whole life since high school. So reflecting back on that, I think he really opened my eyes to the possibility of freedom for myself by giving me new perspectives on the things that were most immediate and around me. I did not need to submit to common understandings and common practices. And then also pointed to the possibility of fulfillment through individual pursuits. And interestingly, not pursuits that necessarily involved power in the common sense, but power in the sense of, or individual pursuits, meaningful pursuits in the sense of freedom from constraints from others.
Dan, if you don't mind, how about letting everybody else talk about those things, and then you can take your time, because you will probably have a lot more to say, but I want to hear everybody else's, what they have, what they're getting. So it's going to be Kevin, and then I encourage Govert and Mike and David to speak as well. So Kevin, go ahead. What are you learning from?
First, I like his authentic for himself.
Mhm.
He deeply like he used the knife, try open up his mind, try find something new. It's different. He live this democracy world, but he criticize that. That's so valuable, and it's like tip away of one side of a coin. Like, so you just look at one side, is look another side. Both sides, you see the picture, then compare it with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is James.
Yeah, I think the most important thing I learned from Nietzsche is that the belief, the faith, and the idea of the will to power, not over others, but over yourself. That you do have this kind of will that is part of your nature, and that you can rely on that to overcome your own limitations and a lot of the natural sufferings that life imposes on us. But the other, so that just that kind of like the power to overcome oneself, and that's also a creative power that you can rely on to be creative.
Wonderful. Govert, you've been studying Nietzsche for a long time. So what have you learned from Nietzsche? What is the most important thing that you get from Nietzsche?
That's pretty complex because he's very inspiring, but it's kind of mysterious how and why. I can agree that he can put you to courage in thinking, courage in doing, not just to for yourself to better your own life, but also to stick out your neck with your creativity to become the salt of society. In his middle periods, especially in Human All Too Human, his idea of the free spirit was not this free spirit lives for himself. The free spirit is a essential component of society itself and its development. But the free spirit has to make very risky choices that goes to against conventions, but will be good and beneficial for society. But the moment that you do it, that it's not seen as such. You're just an aberration that's experimenting, and there might be not many people that see what you're trying to do, and you might fail also. Nietzsche knew that in his lifetime his books were not selling, but he knew that it was very valuable what he was doing. So he had this ongoing idea that I'm living for the future. It will be future generations that will dig what I'm doing, but not necessarily my own generation. So there's an enormous courage implied in his life that I find very inspiring.
Wonderful, beautifully put. David, David Sternman, would you like to share what you think about Nietzsche?
Oh, well, my gut feeling is that every time I pick it up and read the next aphorism, I'm going to completely react negatively and go, this can't be. What is he saying? And so he keeps you constantly on the fire. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you. Mike Amori, would you like to share what you get from Nietzsche?
Yeah, it's strange. I don't really know Nietzsche prior to coming to these meetups. So as I'm listening, I kept getting these feelings of first the time that he was writing, I have a real appreciation. I think you alluded to this earlier in the night. I had a conversation with my niece this weekend, who's a political theorist, about Darwin. And I didn't quite hear from her an appreciation from the time of which he was writing. I'm getting the same feeling as someone who's just getting exposed to Nietzsche about having an appreciation from when all of this was coming out. And I'm also getting the sense of a feeling of resilience a little bit, like a way to build it, a way to fight through what seems to be mystery, sort of a Taoist comment as well. Those are my initial reactions. But in the background, it just seems that there's this need to become resilient to get through what's coming up next, what's inevitably coming up next. Those are my first impressions.
Wonderfully put, because I think those capture, because what happens is that, see, there is advantage of not knowing something, because you come into it and it hits you and you notice something that somebody who might be steeped in it will never notice, because they are like water, fish in water, they don't know that there is water.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. Brian, would you like to comment what you're getting from Nietzsche? Brian or Mike of Magical Realism?
I did comment already.
No, sorry, the other Brian Allenby. Okay. Mike Magical, would you like to comment?
Oh, I think he's wrong about everything, and his philosophies screwed up his life and a number of other lives. However, he's created a number of straw men that made a whole lot of people think about things, and including his negative straw man came out positive for some people. So eternal recurrence, which they're not firm principles. They need to be flexibly. Social Darwinism, as we mentioned, and what everybody and Gilbert said a lot of things that were along the same line, although he put a more positive spin on it than I did.
Thank you, Mike. Lonnie, I know that you're new. Would you like to comment? Okay. Next up is Lloyd. Lloyd, go ahead. What have you whatever you know about Nietzsche? What do you think you have learned from him?
Well, I think again, with a limited amount of knowledge, I think the courage does seem to stand out for me, because I don't want to stereotype Germanic people, but they generally follow rules, and go along with the program. And this guy is not like that at all. I mean, it's one thing to be a rebel from a easygoing society or whatever, but this guy was a rebel from like a real rule-oriented kind of thing. So there is a lot of courage there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lloyd. Phil, you wanted to comment about what you get. What are the most important things you've gotten from Nietzsche? Go ahead.
Well, I just want to refine my statement about destiny, because, for such a long time, actually throughout history, we think of that we're controlled by our fate. God, the powerful government, what it is. He's telling you that there is a difference between fate and destiny. You make your destiny. You do not have to be controlled by fate itself. So you at least take part in it. So that's very important to make that distinction, because you steer your own ship.
Yes, no, beautifully put. For me, I really love Nietzsche as an artist and as a human being, because I do not like him as a philosopher, but I do love him as an artist and as a human being, because what he shows me in his work, mostly Zarathustra is my favorite of his. It shows me that each of us has that ability to direct, like Phil was saying, of shaping your destiny, it takes enormous amount of courage. It requires willingness to face failures, suffering, but it is worth it. And you have a guiding mechanism within you to do it. That is what I get from Nietzsche. And it integrates with the thing where his view of how the world is put together is not clear, because he's not integrated the fact that not just he has it, but everybody has that. And the fact that everybody has that, the upside of working with such beings is humongous. And you need structures to make that happen. So for example, America has both of those. You know, the founding fathers had both of those. They had reverence for the individual. See, that's the thing I like about Nietzsche. He has reverence for what a human being can be. What founding fathers had is on the top of that, they said, how should these people, such magnificent creatures, interact with one another? And they came up with a way of doing that made it possible. It has to come from within. All the initiative is within each of us. But the structures that we produce to work together really multiplies it exponentially. It's like not just even 10 times, it's like 1,000 times to 1,000,000 times the value that can be created in space as well as in time. So that respect for creation of that value of social network of such individuals, that he does not get. But ultimately, getting that part right, the core right, is a huge thing. Again, in terms of ideas, you know, how do you, the structure and ideas are connected. So because he doesn't get structure, he doesn't get ideas as well. But he has the core, but how to kind of integrate it into the world, he doesn't quite have it. But I really love the fact that he has the core, because if you don't have that, you don't have anything. Nothing else really matters if you don't have that. So in that sense, he is truly great. But he's an artist, you know. I call him artist because what he does is that a great artist will show you a potential. He will not actually teach you how to get there, but he will hold a beacon up and say, look, this is possible. You have to climb yourself. You know, there is no way. Nobody will take you up there. You have to climb, but they will show you the beacon. Govert, and then wait a minute. Yeah, Govert, go ahead. And then Brian Allenby. Govert.
Yeah, I'm gonna challenge you, Shrikant, a little bit on Nietzsche as a philosopher. He doesn't kind of fit into the canon of Western philosophy because of his absolutely individualistic genius and style. But if you're a student of philosophy, and you know your Kant and Descartes and the history and Schopenhauer, etc., there are nuggets of absolute lightning bolts in his philosophy by which you have to rethink your own concept of Western philosophy and how all these thinkers, interacted and contributed to truth and the whole Western Enlightenment project, which also has influence, of course, on the founding fathers and the American project as a project of enlightenment. So his worth as a philosopher is not very visible. It's not very obvious, but it becomes obvious if you are, like me, a student of philosophy. Then you find, oh yeah, this connects with this and this connects with that. and then it becomes kind of a different experience. So the context you then need. So that's just my little defense of him as a
No,
philosopher.
that's a great point. Very well taken, because what happens is that you see echo of his, response to him throughout everything that happens afterwards. So that's very well put. Brian and then Dan. Dan, sorry about keeping you waiting, but I wanted to have everybody get their feel, have their say, so what you have created. Okay. So next up is Brian Allenby.
Okay, so I missed your call that time. I didn't get the microphone switched on fast enough. But okay, I have gone through most of my life wanting to read Nietzsche and never really getting the courage to do so. So I was very happy to sort of follow this and try and understand. I have to admit, a great deal of the speakers absolutely over my head. I didn't understand a lot of what was going on. I particularly wanted to read the book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I did read it, and intensely difficult. However, today I picked up another book called Nietzsche's Epic of the Soul by someone called T.K. Siang, who professes to simplify that particular volume. So I look forward to reading that and see if he actually does a good job.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. Dan, the floor is all yours. Take it away.
I've been studying Nietzsche and philosophy for more than 20 years. And I put Nietzsche down maybe 5-7 years ago, decided to move on with other forms of philosophy to come back to it. The thing that always stuck in my craw, especially in culture, is that culture in some ways captured what I would call the Nietzschean villain very adequately and persuasively. In Star Trek, you have Khan, for which he is a Nietzschean villain. But in a lot of movies and television series, like in Batman, Joker is a Nietzschean villain. I was trying to think about 7 years ago, what would a Nietzschean hero look really like? Would it be Superman? Is that the real Nietzschean hero? And having picked him up for the last month and a half and going through and filtering all the information that I had gathered from college and trying to come up with all these texts, I started to think more positively rather than negatively about Nietzsche. There was many critical things that Nietzsche had to say, but I felt that it had to be said so that it would sweep the trash out of the kitchen, so that you would have a meal to prepare with the things that had been cut up and kept onto the table. And I felt that fundamentally there was a possibility that there could be such thing as a Nietzschean hero. It's just not been explored. And so I love doing this for the first time with that in mind, that I've been looking for that type of answer, and I found it. On the whole, the things that I wanted to praise about Nietzsche was that in some ways he had authentic courage to say to people, there are certain things that are unbelievable, and that these things shouldn't control our lives. And we shouldn't give up our common sense for them. And I agree that there's this strong criticism against Nietzsche because he's a writer for the individual. He's not the writer for a people. And in fact, he wants to give the advice on the opposite way, to run away from people. And his values, for example, are that of the anchorite, the hermit. Anchorites and hermits are solitary individuals. That this was his idol in some ways. That was man alone with himself outside of society, but grown out of it. And I thought that that is what you see with the artistic venture of jazz. That you see this artistic venture with painting in the last century, the same artistic venture that has been in cinema and television and fiction and the novels, that Nietzsche's own philosophical outlook, his own aesthetics, have affected the last century so engrossingly that the only thing that you can sometimes look at now is the idea that Nietzsche is a villain for having said things that cracked open the egg and left people without the omelet because the egg spilled. And I think that that's a valuable thing because in essence, what religion and morality gives you is that you should suffer until you die. You have no hope of any salvation in this life, and that you should worship the idea of an afterlife. If this is not palpable to you as an answer, if this is unsatisfying, then the other answer, Nietzsche says, is going to be just as horrific. That is, you should run into the gaping jaws of suffering, agony, pain, adversity, all the toughness, all those things without end and without any need to argue with yourself, because what happens in the end of throwing yourself into the jaws like that is that you're transformed and that you come out as a new person. Nietzsche says that fundamentally, out of life's school of war, that which doesn't destroy you makes you stronger. And that this is the advice that we should take from Nietzsche, not that God is dead. God is dead is something that is silly and symbolic, and that only Philosophy 101 students should obsess about this issue. And I hope I've made this clear over the last month, that part of Nietzsche is not very interesting. The stuff that we've been talking about tonight is far more relevant, far more interesting, because it affects the subject more deeply than this idea about the death of God. I think Nietzsche also suffered from an incurable amount of romanticism, for which the idea of the immorta fate, the eternal recurrence, these things are certain experiments with it. They're flirting with romanticism from the Stoics, from the Cynics, and from the Epicureans, that Nietzsche found them solidly on his side. This idea that the will to power is a psychological force that explains why people believe in morality, why people are willing to defend the idea of moral custom. It has a lot to do with the idea that they feel power by it, not because moral custom is right. And there are plenty of moral customs that are not right. And that the reason why they're not right is because they're just systems of power over the individual. And we should become reflective on that as a society, because I think Nietzsche is correct in diagnosing that mankind is childish so long as they live under the auspice of morality. That morality makes us like children, and it turns us and fanalizes us, and it tells us these are the values you should be obsessed with, but not these values. These ones that are beyond morality, oh my God, don't consider those. Those should never have been put on the plate in the first place, because we provided you the answer. Why don't you accept it? So Nietzsche's really good at that. The last thing that Nietzsche is good at is, I think Nietzsche as a good boxer, and that the aphorism is nothing more than his intellectual jab. It might take a lot of work to understand that jab. It might take a lot of intellectual work, but that's what Nietzsche wants you to do. He wants you to feel unsettled. He wants you to feel uncomfortable. And he wants you to feel that doing philosophy is bloody dangerous. It should be dangerous, because on the other end of the idea of knowledge is wisdom. And Nietzsche says that if we didn't have to overcome so much shame in the process of knowledge, that it would not be attractive in the first place. And that is essentially what this is, that there are certain systems that have left us meek and ignorant, and there are other systems that we need to adopt to overcome that. That's all I have to say about that.
Wonderful. So there are several things. I wanted, this is, this discussion is amazing, okay, because this is like, we're building on everything that we've been doing and kind of putting it together. one thing that I see is that, for all his talk against morality, I see him as being a very deep valuer in terms of valuing, of saying, okay, that individual soul is valuable. What you do with your life is important. So he is the opposite of a nihilist. He doesn't like, the other point that I got from what you're saying is that he definitely has that, that he's holding the ascetic, the hermit, as the ideal. And in that, when you were talking about, coming up with a Nietzschean hero, my immediate answer is that is Zarathustra. That is the Nietzschean hero. Somebody who kind of goes away, then tries to come back to people to give them something and says, oh, they don't want it, and goes, and it also shows, I think, saying that the hermit is his ideal, also captures the fact that he doesn't really understand the society and kind of the dynamics of it. The thing that he understands and he's very sensitive to is the negative impact the society has on an individual. That he is very, very sensitive to. Every little thing, little ways in which it undercuts the ability of an individual to become himself. That is what he's very aware of. So I'm really looking forward to kind of continuing this. Let's see. So please, this is a good time to kind of bring as much thing, but let's keep it at the deepest level possible about Nietzsche. Okay. So it's going to be Phil followed by James. Phil.
Yeah, I want to defend Nietzsche as a philosopher because he's a great artist. Because the philosophy itself is not a discipline about knowledge, but about wisdom, the love of wisdom. And in a sense, at one time, philosophy actually was the union between poetry and philosophy. The fact that it split off meant that it lost to a certain degree, or try to pretend that knowledge, pure knowledge itself is wisdom. And he's brought back the poetic aspect in wisdom that had cut us off from what wisdom should be. So in that sense, I want to defend him wholeheartedly as reorienting philosophy to wisdom rather than running away from it. But through his art, through his task as an artist, because he's reuniting that twin pillar of understanding that's heading toward wisdom. So thank you, Dr. Nietzsche.
Beautifully put. I mean, one way to think of it, I think of it as logos and mythos, of kind of conceptualization in words and actually living it in full integrated way of emotions, physical movement, and art. What art does is that art actually is, kind of actually shows you what those ideas are. So he brings that together. And all great artists do that. Even when they don't have the words for it, they're actually showing you that. They're actually manifesting the philosophy. And that's what he does. So it's going to be Mike followed by James. Mike.
Yeah, Dan, thank you very much. First of all, your boxing analogy about throwing a jab, I thought it was fantastic because as someone who's really new and just learning about this, and you also said you're supposed to feel uncomfortable. I felt like you were jabbing at me all night, like everybody was, because it's new to me. And I'm very curious to know why you used the musical genre jazz before as being Nietzschean. Are you a musician to say that, or are you a fan of jazz? I'm curious how you connected that to his philosophy.
I'm a fan of jazz. I'm not a musician. Well, I think it had a lot to do with the viewpoint that jazz is a system that's designed to use what you say, simple formalizations in an improvised way. And so not only you have to have the basic technique of knowing how to perform a musical instrument to do the job, but you have to have a mastery over that so that improvisation, it just looks supernaturally natural to you. And so the reason why that jazz to me stood out was that, to me, jazz was the perfect example of Nietzsche's three metamorphoses of the spirit. That in some ways we have what you might think of as pillars of music, where you had 4 different or 5 different basic sounds, and all of them were representation of reason. And so several different kinds of instruments wrapped around that idea and played with that idea to the point that it created a formalization of like the piano or the harp or the horn. It isn't until classical music that tries to formalize this that you have, Beethoven, Bach, and Mozart. That's great, and Rachmaninoff. That's great, but it's people who were educated in those things that went, I'm going to transcend it. I'm just going to throw all those conventions aside and let's explore something that's deeply emotional, that's incredibly touching to our will, and not only that, but has a transformative power for not only the artist, but the listener as well. And I thought, this is perfect Nietzschean idea. This capsizes what Nietzsche is after in the positive sense, that art in this sense that it's not only Apollonian in the way that it uses formulas and it dreams up good sketches, but it's Dionysian in the sense that those players who know those formalizations can jump right into it, improvise, and have a totally different piece of music, which was originally meant to be one other way. And you can think of like the work of The Color Blue. Yes, The Color of Blue, Miles Davis. Is that? No, Kind of Blue. You can think of that piece of work. You need to understand that group probably produced 20, 30 different albums from just basic formalizations. And they found the best sounding version of it and they made a record. But the rest of it was tossed over because it was the artist who grew from that activity and then built literally a style of music after it that everybody else now listens to and goes, I wish I could be an artist in this sense where I can play with reality by knowing what the rules are and knowing how to break them. And I think that's why jazz and hip hop are perfect examples of what I would literally say Nietzschean philosophy. Because again, with hip hop says, I'm going to take these conventions, I'm going to create an internal line where they repeat themselves as a pattern over and over, and it's going to touch you. But I'm going to lay some poetry down on top of that. And now I'm going to connect with you as a human being on top of that. Even better, I'm going to rhyme. I'm going to do it in rhyme, which still now requires a formalization, but also an ability of Nietzschean play. And so these systems of thought that have come out of our culture are Nietzschean in that sense that they're positive because they have dropped off and they've taken away those conventions and said they're not necessary unless we need to use them. And they're only necessary to their use. And look, I'm not going to prop it up like it's some kind of God. I'm just going to move on to my next musical piece.
Wonderful. Next up is James. Sorry, Mike, you had something? Okay, all right. James.
Yeah, I understand. Nietzsche is an artist of ideas. So does that make him a philosopher? But he has this notion of the historical sense, where he talks about the noble hero as someone who understands history backwards and forwards, in terms of like 2,000 years backwards and forwards. And that makes him a someone who can really have this kind of historical sense. Can you, summarize what he means by that?
Well, Nietzsche thinks that the human subject is tied to a historical sense in the way that the beast is not. The beast isn't even able, if you were to ask, you, Cal, why are you happy? If it were to answer, it would just lull right back into its unhistorical sense where it's not even able to reflect, let alone respond. And I think in some ways, the human subject realizes that we envy the beast because it lives so unhistorically. It lives so deep into the present. When I deal now with people who have dogs, I teach them how to calm their dogs. I have 4 dogs with me tonight, and one of them is an unfixed male. And so there's constant fighting every night and every morning. And what I try to teach them is that nonverbal communication is best with a dog. Why? Because of how you hold yourself in the present tells the dog that can trust you. But if you use words, it will only make the dog more confused because the dog lives unhistorically. It lives in the moment. And the only way for us to understand the idea of even commands is that you had to repeat the command over and over until you get the dog to do what you want. And that takes time. That takes a way where the human being acts as a sculptor and the animal, no matter how wild or domesticated, becomes the sculpture. And that this project of the human being imposing an anthropomorphism on nature changes nature for what it is. Now, the human animal has been changed by morality this way. That is, the human animal has been forced into becoming domestic and unable to evolve out of that kind of domestication. Now, I think Nietzsche thought that this was a problem that he himself didn't know how to get out of. That is, wherever the limits of your value are, there's no exit for you to get behind your values to look at them objectively. It would require you to have a new set of values to make that valuation. And so you're stuck in the world of the valuation you have. Now, Nietzsche says that what is more interesting is that human character is unable for the human subject to change their character. And Nietzsche says that what it would require is a human being to live several thousand years so that it would then immediately realize that it would have to adapt to new environments. And thus its character would be more flexible had it lived this long. Nietzsche thinks that it's the short life that has a way of making the human being stubborn because it builds, psychologists talk about this idea of transference. They have certain experience, you create a pattern artificially, and then as you're an adult, you have some uncertainty or insecurity, you go back to a pattern that you learned as a child, and you take that information and transfer it up into the future where you are. And this kind of what you might call monumental historical making in the human subject as an experience is problematic because there's no critical sense of history for the subject. That is, you're using the monumental value of what your experiences are, not so that you could become super aware of them and try to transcend them, but rather to use them as a format of judging and evaluating your current circumstance. Whether or not that current circumstance meets the pattern that you believe is something entirely different. It's that your human nature goes, well, I'm going to go after lowest hanging fruit. Logic does this. It aims at Occam's razor. I grab the nearest thing and I use it as my most reliable, valued tool. Now, whether or not that's good for the human subject, Nietzsche thinks is bad because we haven't gone to reevaluate our values. And so it isn't about whether or not the world has facts. It's why have we used certain systems of value to evaluate those facts? What has happened with us in the way that we become stale this way and decadent, as Nietzsche calls it?
So Dan, I want to bring up another point. It's a very complex point. So I'm going to have to give a little bit of introduction. This is based on kind of work of Walter Ong. There are these folks at Center for Study of Digital Life that I've been working with. what this view is that technology changes over time. And depending on the technology, the way we use our minds and way we use our faculties is shaped by the technology that you're using. So for example, in the oral world, right? When I'm speaking to you, I'm using my entire body. I'm using gestures. There is a tone of my voice. There is emotion that is carried. There is the body language. And words are kind of floating on the top of that. And the words, all of these other things, all these other senses are providing the context for the words. So it's a very rich environment in the oral world. Now, fast forward to writing. Okay, I'm a big fan of writing. It's extremely powerful. It makes things transmittable at a level which the oral world could not do at all. Initially, when the writing was done, it was done in a small group, mostly in monasteries, where you are actually writing. And when you're reading, you actually read out aloud, and there are other people who are actually reading the same book and writing and talking and discussing, kind of like what we are doing here. Okay, so whatever the writing is, the way you're engaging with that writing is in this context of both social and full-bodied, embodied experience. Okay, so that's the kind of scribal period. Now, something really radically different happens with the advent of print. Again, print is tremendously life-giving. But what it does is that it privileges your sequential movement of eyes over a fixed thing, and that as a mode of taking in ideas. It is separated out from the entire milieu of this full-bodied experience. Ideas become abstract, increasingly dissociated from life. Speech itself, the words themselves get separated from it. And then it builds and builds so that there is all these multiple voices. And people read without writing. I don't know how they do that, but people read without writing. Now, what are you doing when you're reading without writing? See, normally when I'm listening to you, right? When I'm talking to you, we are going back and forth. It's a full context. You are watching what is happening with my, in my reactions. You are adjusting to that. And we are making sure that we are on the same page. So there is that entire context of multiple senses of an individual being and the social context together, which is serving as the context for the ideas. All of that goes away. When you're reading, you don't have that. And most of the readers don't write. So what they're doing is that they are passively taking in sequence of somebody who has abstracted something out. So at every stage, it gets dissociated from real life.
Yeah, Phil said.
Let me just complete.
Yes. Yes.
So this is the environment in which Nietzsche comes. So Nietzsche, in some ways, is retrieval. What he's doing is that he's retrieving the oral tradition, the embodied tradition. He's saying whatever you're doing is dead because it is abstracted out so much that it has lost. It is those coins which have lost everything. They're being passed around so much that all meaning in it is gone. You're actually dealing with husk, and in that form, they're actually prisons for you because you have lost the living thing that was keeping it going. And what he is really saying, bring back this entire full-bodied, full emotional experience and all ideas have to be infused with that. Otherwise, to the hell with them. They need to be burnt. So that's how, so it is kind of retrieval of the oral tradition, if you want to just look at it purely at a technical level, technological level. What do you think?
I think what I would say is that philosophically, we have to distinguish philosophy in the monological sense from philosophy in the dialogical sense. And so the philosophy in the monological sense is you interacting with the text alone, right? And bringing your own subjectivity, your own biases, your own understanding, even your own nuances, right? Your personality to it. That's one thing, but that is the worst, or the I would say the most base form of philosophy, because you're not going to learn from that. And you're not going to become engrossed to the point where you really understand the stuff that you're talking about when you try to teach philosophy in a class, or try to teach yourself philosophy and what you should do, things like this. It is what we would naturally call a marketplace of ideas, where an idea is put out and the best idea gets voted up, and the people have a way of going, ooh, this is toxic, this is yummy. And therefore, the way that common sense has a way of going towards one thing as opposed to another, which we were doing tonight with aphorisms, the way of doing that wonderfully this way is the way Nietzsche would think of it, is that we're ordering rank. We're ordering what our values are. What is the most important thing out of these 5 ideas to talk about, right? And so this kind of activity as philosophy is what I would say priceless, because even though there should be a cost put onto this, should be very exclusive. But this is priceless because I don't know what your conventions are. I don't even know what your skills are. And so once I put my skills onto the table and you put yours, and we begin to interact, like, here's my ideas, here's yours, here are how I think these ideas work. Oh, these are these problems, things like that. As we engross into it, it isn't just I develop, it's all of us developing and growing at once. We're gaining something by not only watching and observing, but by doing too, vicariously watching these things transform themselves. Now, because we're dealing with Nietzsche, and Nietzsche wants us to do this, he really wants us to sit down here and go, well, what does he really mean that there is no such thing as morality? They're just interpretations. Well, Nietzsche would say, well, you haven't really thought about it that way, at the correct way. Here's another way of thinking about it. At a play, you have the actor and you have the spectator. The same thing is true with morality. You have the doer of morality and the judges of morality and how they evaluate. So thus, you're not going to have the same moralities. You're going to have 2 different narratives, 2 different interpretations about one issue. Now, if this is an issue about, let's say, a rich man buying a poor man and his family, you would go, oh, that's gross, that's disgusting. Why would you ever consider that? Well, Nietzsche would say, well, this is where the birth of moral value started. The birth of moral value started where there were unconscious beings who were exploiting other beings who were aware of the exploitation and eventually rebelled from that, and then dominated those people who had dominated them and created a moral system according to that. Now, unfortunately, that moral system was dependent on the crisis that led them there. And so, unfortunately, this group, they don't want to overcome history. What they want to do is they want to make it linear, as if we're stuck back there in 33 CE, Common Era, where Jesus had been crucified. That's where we're supposed to be. We're not allowed to allow history to unfold or anything else until this problem is reconciled. And since there's no reconciliation, we live with people who create static systems, who are monological by their nature, in the way that they elicit the reader to read it and then to memorize it as a form of mnemonic. But it's not asking you to exercise your memory. Nietzsche is asking you to do something entirely different. He's saying you need to exercise your intellect. That's the deeper value. And if you live in a world where, yes, morality is right, morality is about custom, oh, great. But look what it does. It makes the criminal worse, right? Even worse, it doesn't give anybody positive understanding of what moral values are. How do you act as a good human being? How are you compassionate to other people? What is the real value of forgiveness? Or what is the real value of sympathy and empathy? Why are these more constructive than pain and guilt and pity and all these other things? Why is it that morality is obsessed with guilt and pity and not with empathy and compassion? Well, it's because morality is just the system that's designed to control you. And morality is set up for the society to preserve it. It's not set up for the individual to grow. So there's a guy by the name of, what's his name? Cornel West. He did a talk some years ago called Race Matters. He made an observation, and it came into two forms. He said, look, yes, Socrates is right that the unexamined life is not worth living. But what Socrates left out and what Malcolm X had to do was mention to us that the examined life is painful. And the second thing he pointed out was that inevitably in our society values intelligence, but it hates, it resents, it detests intellect. Why is that? Well, it's because just because you have intelligence, we're still equal. But if you have intellect, we're no longer equal. That is, in some sense, our view of the value of intelligence serves our covert egalitarianism. But it doesn't really serve the real best purpose for society. Not in the same sense that, like, an anthill will grow certain rebellious ants that will then leave the anthill and risk life and limb to find new food, new colonies, in the same way that Star Trek did for 5 years. New worlds, new civilizations to go boldly go out into the unknown. That's why ants do it. But that is the purpose for human beings, that there are going to be individuals in our society that are going to stand out, and they're going to rise above the common moral trend, not because they're murdering psychopaths, but because they are artists. And that artist in this sense requires a room of ethical autonomy and authenticity in order for it to thrive. That is, a free spirit isn't supposed to be self-centered. It's supposed to find new colonies and new food sources for the rest of human beings and bring that back. That's what its purpose is. And Nietzsche thinks that overall, this idea is meant to breed an Übermensch, something that has overcome the human, that is no longer human, that is something on the end of the bridge of what we call humanity. And that is the same thing that most people are doing. If you ask, why do you work so hard? Well, so that my kids, when they become adults, they can do well, and then their grandchildren. And you might be thinking of it the same way that if you were a grandpa, you're not doing what you're doing right now just for your grandkids. You're doing it for your great-grandkids. You're doing it for the prosperity and not only that, but the flourishing improvement of future generations. Now, I think that this is well seen where Moses goes through the Exodus. He doesn't immediately go to Israel. They walk around the desert for a long time. Why? Because those liberated slaves cannot be free. We cannot free them because look what they do. They worship cows. They lie in bed with each other. They turn into pigs the moment that we give them freedom. So we can't give them freedom. And we know that these parents, these slave parents, they're going to do their worst to their children. They're going to screw them up. So we can't give them freedom. No, you can't do that. No, but the promised land, by the way, is promised to that third generation, further away, 45 years away from this. If you think about generations as 15, 15, and 15. Why? Why is it guaranteed to the third generation, not the generation that had been liberated through Exodus? Because they're bloody children and their values are fit for children. they were not fit to be liberated, but hopefully their grandchildren are. And so their struggles was only meaningful to the degree that they knew that their future generations, the weight of existence in agony would be reduced. And so Nietzsche is having this in mind when he's writing Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He's hoping that future generations will put all of this religious sickness and decay aside and get real, get realistic with itself, and turn away from it and grow up. Because what's very important, the way that Nietzsche thinks of himself, he thinks that doing is being, whereas Kant thinks that being is doing. Sinatra thinks that it's doobie-doobie-doo, but we have these two different perspectives from it, that ontology is found in action in the way that the subject is a gerund, whereas the Kantian style, that the subject is a noun that's looking to incorporate the verb within itself. And unfortunately, it discovers the being or the verb, but not the noun, the self itself in this process. It's divorced. And so it requires an external system to give it guidance. And that system is designed to be reliable in the sense that if you were to choose other actions, they would lead to what you might think is maximum harm. I shouldn't kill myself. Why? Because if everybody else killed themselves, we would lead to humanity to annihilation. That's why I should agree that suicide is wrong. Well, Nietzsche would say, no, that is a silly, simplistic, childish rationalization that only a Platonist would say. The real person would say, no, there's a point where euthanasia makes sense, where it's an ethical duty and right. And the other hand, that euthanasia doesn't make sense because it is murder. And Nietzsche thinks that most of philosophy can't tell us what to do or what to do better because it's failed in the first sense to establish what is good in the first place.
Wow. Dan, I want to comment on two things. The first is this quote. I don't have it exactly, but it's from Marshall McLuhan. And this is my favorite quote from him. He says, there is a deep-seated repugnance in the human heart against understanding the actual principles on which they are operating, because it implies far too much responsibility. So that means what he's saying is that if most people would just say, okay, I'm following the morality, I'm doing whatever I'm supposed to do, let me not think too much about it. Because if you start thinking too much about it, it means that you have to actually take responsibility. And that is what people don't want to do. So that's one thing. Second thing is I wanted to comment on the one remark that you made, that what we are doing here is priceless. Because this is actually how ideas, I think, have to be dealt with. This is the only way actually to do ideas. The level, and it's kind of, you can see how much win-win there is. Look, your understanding of Nietzsche is far, far greater than mine, okay? My skills about putting together a discussion are, I think, higher than yours. And like both of us just very eagerly accept that, and we work together, okay? And we are trying to see what we can do together, right? Each person who is here, right? I mean, Govert actually knows Nietzsche very deeply, okay? Brian has been studying Nietzsche all his life, off and on, okay? Mike has not heard of Nietzsche, but he is actually open to learning new ideas, and he will bring in things. Brian Allenby has been studying a whole range of topics, and he's kind of been at the edge of Nietzsche, trying out occasionally. So you have Mike has studied everything, okay? all kinds of fields, okay? And he can talk about any field for about 3 hours at a stretch if I let him do that, okay? So I have to always give him time limits. Otherwise it's a mess. He has amazing things to say. But what it does is that it's, Kevin brings a completely different aspect. Dave tries to learn everything that we throw at him. Okay, but what happens is that each person, Lloyd is just shown up. He doesn't know anything about Nietzsche, but he's very, very stridently, kind of is free to express his disagreements. Okay, there are people who, like Lonnie, who's just listening. Okay, all of us are actually getting a level of value from this conversation, which is actually very rare. It is possible to have groups like this, but usually these groups you build over like friends or associates over a long period of time. And there are very few of them. That's number one. Second, in those groups, there tends to be almost like echo chamber kind of things develop in them. Not because there are anything wrong with the people, but just because it's a limited group of close group of people. This is an open group. Anybody can show up. Anybody can show up and bring whatever it is that they have to bring. And everybody here actually engages with whatever comes in. There are people here who keep coming back again and again. Hundreds of meetups. So they're developing like this common vocabulary over multiple fields. Like, for example, I did not know you were familiar with Tao Te Ching, that I could just, when I mentioned something, you would say, oh, number 17, he says this, and number this says that. And you're able to bring, because we are trying to do these across multiple disciplines, people are beginning to make connections. There are people who are very, very strong in some things, and they will be able to talk about that. And all of this is going on together in a way. I have struggled very hard to come up with enough structure so everybody can express themselves without hurting other people, without taking my standard is that every 2 minutes, everybody should feel, I am glad I lived these 2 minutes. I cannot, the second thing is that I cannot do this for 1 minute. I give 1 minute leeway for people so that I want people to be able to put things in their own way, make mistakes. But 2 minutes, I have to make sure that everybody gets something from it. So that's the standard I have. And I have very simple rules to do that. I keep explaining those rules again and again so everybody knows that I'm trying to be fair. I'm not particularly good at doing this. So I do what I can. And I'm sure I'm making lots of mistakes. But I think everybody has the right thing in their hearts, that they are trying to learn. And they are actually, everybody is very generous in offering to others whatever they know. And everybody is receptive in trying to actually figure out what other people are saying. And we are all sitting all over the place, all over US, sometimes all over the world. And I think this is what ideas are meant to be. This is like the peripatetic school of Aristotle. I'm not comparing about the ideas or quality of things we are generating. I'm talking about the process, or more closely, the stoicism that Stoics, met, or, like Socrates sitting in the market, engaging anybody who shows up. All of those are great traditions. So, and I'm particularly grateful to people like you, Dan, who bring so much to it. And I like the attitude. Okay, I like the fact that you study a lot, that you have a lot of knowledge about it, At the same time, you will engage with people, no matter what they say. You will engage with people, you will try to explain your thing, you're trying to be empathic to understanding what they are saying, and you're relating to that. I don't think it's like, I think it's just good. Okay, I think that's just a human way of doing things, because that's, if you want to learn, that's the only attitude you can have. So though it's remarkable, I think that is normal for human beings. So that's why, I mean, so I think that is, and what that makes possible is that, I mean, one of the interesting things I found is that especially people who know a lot find that they learn a lot in this kind. They get a lot more value, because partly it is in preparation, right? You're preparing of saying, okay, how do I bring all the aphorisms together? I'm sure you would get like almost like 70% of the value in yourself doing that, because it's a huge project, of saying, okay, how do I arrange it? What happens when I put them in chronological order? What do they look like? And because you have the entire context, you will see something new. And then on the top of that, people will bring up things from all kinds of directions. And if you know more, then you are able to learn more as a result of it, if your mind is open. So I think this is remarkable, Dan. And I think what I'm, it's just wonderful.
Well, I hope we set down the foundation for Nietzsche night.
What's that?
I hope we set down a foundation for Nietzsche night.
Yes. Yes.
We could bring these aphorisms in, use them as we see fit, and try to sort out what Nietzsche's after, and probably what's wrong in his thought, because I think it's a good insight to point out that Nietzsche doesn't spend much time in the idea of sustaining a basis for life. He doesn't think that there's anything worth putting that into. And that's very odd, because, well, it isn't. In some ways, in his youth, his youth benefited from that stability, that basis, on the way through education, all the way up to war, and then through a bit of teaching, but that failed. After that, Nietzsche was a vagabond. And so maybe his philosophy in this way is a product of that, where it is looking away from society, banishing oneself from it, and thinking of oneself basically an island unto yourself. There is a certain attractiveness to it, but I think that that's a failure.
Yeah,
because Nietzsche would think there's something like, why would Zarathustra go and give people his initial religion, go, oh, I'm just going to run to the mountains for another decade, and then come back and go, oh, I got more message.
So
the reason is because they were deaf to the first message, maybe.
So for the next time, what I want to do, I like your idea. I think aphorisms worked very well, but the next time, as you're planning, you will organize it by topic. So you would have probably maybe 10 per topic, something like that, which is where people can get their mind around. All of
I was thinking 5, and then putting 20 ideas into one. Actually, I did that. The reason why I presented the chronological one was because it was all of the aphorisms from his early work to his last.
Sure.
And I thought, God, this kind of really shows his evolution of thought. And you could see how he traces his viewpoint on morality to the point that he's like an immoralist from his perspective.
How many groups how many groups of aphorisms do you have now?
I have 5 groups.
5 groups.
Just like the major 5 ideas. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect.
And I did it that way, but I presented it this way tonight.
Wonderful.
Because
so next time, next time, do you want to do all 5, or do you want to break it up into 2 meetups?
I think we should break it up into 2 meetups.
2 meetups. Okay, so just let me know which 2 you want to do. Just email me if you know it.
We'll do 4 ideas, like 4 rooms, and then the last session we'll do Nietzsche's Death of God,
Death of God. Okay, perfect.
as that aphoristic style.
Okay.
So
Perfect. Perfect. And let's do that. So I'm very excited. All right. I'm going to say goodnight, but I will. This has been amazing. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Just wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you, Srikant, and then.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Did you?
Right on.
Wait a minute. You everybody. You have to see the T-shirt. You have to see the T-shirt. You saw the T-shirt?
Yeah. Übermensch. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Good night, everybody.
I
Thanks
can
a
tell
lot,
somebody's
guys.
German
Thank you.
among us.
Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your
Bye.
wisdom.
Gute Nacht.
Bye.